Okay. All right. Well, welcome guys to. I guess this is the second meeting. Um. So some of the topics that I wanted to cover, that's planned anyways, is to give you guys an update of what's been going on so far in terms of the testnet development. What's been going on in terms of the white paper, because I mentioned that we would start putting together one, and some updates about some other things that I know that's going on within the entire, like, let's call it the crypto sphere. That sort of indirectly relates to our project, and so other than that, Unicron was also going to give a brief overview relating to some of the stuff in regards to delegated proof of stake in terms of what we can learn from other projects that have already existed in the past that have used similar mechanisms and other projects that do currently exist, and what problems that they face, and either how they've solved them or how they've avoided solving them, and what kind of problems that's caused. So because Unicron does have to, he told me he has to go in about an hour. I think it actually would make sense if he actually talked first, like just in case I ramble on for too long. So if that's okay with you, Unicron, maybe you can, tell us a little bit about the history of delegated proof of stake.
Yeah. Oop. Is Unicron on?
Hang on.
And if he's talking, second here.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
Got you now. Perfect.
Oh, the window has to be in focus. Sorry.
Maybe you're not running it as an admin.
Yeah, I wasn't, and then I
You're
was
on
talking
Windows.
to my text editor. Anyway, so DPoS was created by Dan Larimer in like 2014 or 2015, and it was very different. DPoS means a lot of different things, like delegates in general is a very basic concept that could mean a lot of different things. It could be really bad or really good. It really depends. Sorry, I'm just drinking some water. And so some recent news, for example, is Lisk, right? It was, I don't know if you guys follow Lisk at all, but on the forums, they found that a bunch of delegates were like combining their money together and possibly, working together, colluding or whatever, well, it's not unclear for what, but it might be linked, send a lot of money to the same accounts. And Lisk is kind of notorious for making it very difficult for people to get voted out, which is one of the most important aspects of DPoS punishment system. I don't know if anybody has specific questions, but basically I'll talk about how we can try to avoid those kind of issues. And Lisk is not the original DPoS. It's created by somebody else much after BitShares and Steem, the original DPoS. And they're all actually themselves different, but Lisk is severely different.
Since we're on the subject, I personally have a question in regards to
Yeah, go ahead.
And voting. So I believe, first of all, I'm going to preface by asking, you helped design the Novusphere consensus system, correct?
I helped with it. It was a collaborative effort.
Okay, for sure. So I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so essentially, I guess since we're on the subject of collaboration between voters and delegates, essentially, I'd like to ask, given the environment, and it's not just Lisk, but there's actually several other DPoS coins that are notorious for, I guess you call it delegate cartels. What steps are we taking here to avoid delegate cartels?
Well, I guess, yeah, we should define delegate cartels. I mean, a lot of delegates do want the best for the system, and they do agree on some things. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to tell between a cartel and, that's malicious and working together for the benefit of the system. And it depends on how much they have at stake, how much risk they're taking, what's the chance they're going to lose their income. And so I have not seen too many different people complaining about, what was the word? Cartels, outside maybe Lisk. And Lisk has problems for a few factors. For example, they have a lot of delegates, right? They have 101 active delegates. So one is they don't actually get the speed as much of a speed upgrade as having less delegates might let you do. And two is nobody can really keep track of how all 101 delegates are behaving. It's just a lot of people. When the system was left alone, like for example, for BitShare, which was the original, you could actually define how many delegates you want. And almost always the number they always reached was about 12. That's about how many people keep track of and vote for and vote out when they misbehaved and so on. So what they did is they went in and they basically decided to fix the number in some recent ones to 21 delegates, which is already more than the system natively selects. And delegates are more like pools rather than the controlling factors. So how do we avoid delegates colluding together? Well, they have to have a risk, something at stake, right? Something at stake is what happens, what you lose when you misbehave. And proof of stake originally didn't have something at stake. I mean, it had some kind of aspects of it, but not really. So technically you could attack and get away with it without too much issues. So what Dan Larimer basically invented is, by accident or maybe not, invented the concept of hiring these block producers to do a job. And if they misbehave, they'll lose the job. But to do that, you need to have, not too many people. You have to have a realistic reward of kicking them out. And Lisk does something that's incredibly, incredibly dangerous, which is it rewards people for voting for active delegates. As in, if you're like in our system, imagine if we had the president, and if you only get money if you vote for the president.
Oh wow, I could see how that's very dangerous.
Yeah, so it's more than one person. It's 101, but because basically what they do is you get a percentage of the reward that the block producers get if you vote for the ones that are actually getting reward. So you can see how that's basically only rewarding people for voting for active producers.
So in other words, as you were saying, you're incentivized to keep the existing people in power rather than to try to vote them out and vote new people in. You're financially motivated to do this.
Exactly, and I don't understand it. It's actually Dan considers it. So Dan, who invented DPoS in general, he considers it as bad as double production or attacking the network. He considers it extremely. That means the job is being overpaid since they can afford to give it money to other people, and that the income for those people should be reduced. And that's what that's what the decentralized governance is supposed to do. When the job is overpaying, they should reduce the salary if they can clearly spread all that money around. And also, there's two aspects to something at stake. Block producers have the job at stake, which is actually, if you lose a job because you attacked the network or you misbehaved, you will probably lose a job for a very long time, which could be forever. So you're missing out on a block reward for forever. I mean, it's an exaggeration, but it's a very significant hit that's incredibly dangerous. And there's not too many spots to get back up there from nothing. So it's a very damaging money-wise attack. It's very costly to attack and get caught.
Just to clarify the answer to my question, you're saying essentially what we're employing here is, first of all, lower number of delegates to prevent collusion of delegates in the first
place.
And second of all, by creating financial disincentives for attack in the first place.
Yes, and the why having less people also helps is to get a delegate out. You might have to move them down by almost 100 spaces in the Lisk system, right? You'd have to, like almost everybody who voted would have to all changed all the voting to move somebody's rank from, let's say, the extreme scenario from 1 to 102. That's 100 spaces of basically difference versus you only have very few limited spots, like 21, for example, which is, if these are considered pools, same thing as like proof of work could be considered delegated proof of work. Then, it's so much better than two mining pools, for example, that control most of the coins. It's basically like a mining pool operator, and you're hiring them to do a job and they could be fired. The only difference is like you have approval systems. It's much more optimal. The extreme people don't win as easily by accident, and other protections. But yes, so we have to keep something. We cannot let people get profit from voting only for active producers, whether they're malicious or not. Because like if you're at Lisk and you want to make money, you have to vote for the active producers. And there's no other way to do that. And that's why in our system, we decided, okay, well, how can we prevent that from happening, right? So one part is first of all, we have fewer producers. We have approval voting, which makes it, I think Lisk has approval voting as well. So I'll skip that part. And then we give, so just for the act of voting, so Decred has the same system. Voting for anybody in general, even if you're undecided or you vote for yourself just to just put a vote out there to get some money, we give, or at least by my design, you give the same block reward in total to the users who vote and to the delegates. So the inflation is split equally between the delegates and the voters. That means if a delegate is giving away money, he is actually going to be diluting himself compared to the voters. So he's actually going to be losing money, and he's not, you know what I mean? So that's one way to prevent the danger of dilution. The second...
Not in his best interest, diluting his own supply.
Yes, he basically so before in the Lisk system, I don't want to use Lisk as the worst thing ever, but in the system that rewards... I lost my track of thought. Saw a picture. In a system where basically they're bribing for votes. They're bribing for people to vote for them, and that's the only way for people to get money, both for the active producers. So because nobody's making money, everybody's actually losing money. All the voters who have vested stake or whatever, they're losing money continuously as inflation comes into the block producers. So by introducing reward for voting, technically, you are finally able to compensate for that. But since they're all making basically zero or negative income, they really want that money. They really want to be bribed, right? Like the block producer is just making most of it. Maybe some goes to the DAO, and the rest is, and the voters get nothing. So in our system, the voters are not having income of zero or negative. They already have an income comparable to a block producer, just because they're actually contributing to the system. They're the people who control the network, like the voters, not the block producers. That's a very important distinction. Now you're not bribing somebody who's losing money or who's has zero income. You're bribing somebody who has an income, and it could be for a decent sized whale, it's comparable to you. So it'll take you a lot to bribe them. One, and two is you'll be diluting yourself, so you'll be hurting yourself even more. And three, of course, is we'll consider a bit hostile action basically to bribe. And that's how we protect the network. Another part is a lot of these DPoS so-called systems, they don't have vested interest for the voters. So we know block producers have vested interest or vest something at stake because they have to keep the job. They have to perform. They hire to do a job. If they do bad, they get fired and they lose income for all eternity, which is a lot of time. The voters in a lot of these systems, they can just vote for one person or the other person. They can switch, can leave in an instant. They can vote for an attacker, and before the attacker acts out, maybe he acts and then they sell it instantly before it hits the market or something, the news. So in our systems, we have a thing where if you want the income, same as in Decred, Steam, EOS, if you vote, you're kind of locked into the system for at least a month. So it doesn't matter who you voted for, if it's an attacker, you will take any hit the network takes with the system. So if you vote for a malicious person, if you start voting for these cartels, you can't just suddenly quickly get rid of it. If the cartel, like right now, Lisk cartel is hitting the news over and over and over again. If you had vested stake in it, that's the last thing you'd want to see, because you would be afraid this would hurt the market value, the trust value of the network. And you'd actually be incentivized to make the network as secure as possible, as centralized as possible.
That's actually a really interesting psychological deterrent toward cartels that I had never considered. Well on you.
It's incredibly, so we're talking about a design that's been in works since 2014, not in theory, but in active practice. And we've seen a lot of these things happen. So Lisk design was actually DPoS version 0 point something, right? They actually got rid of that number, once they released. I'm not exactly sure about all the versions and times, but that was the original design, 101 voters. And they changed it, and they added the vesting period. They always were against the bribing mechanism. Although the ability, giving half of the block reward to the voters is dangerous, maybe. They're not as comfortable with it. But other networks, for example, I brought up Decred before. Decred, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. So Decred invented Decred is the proof of activity system where you buy a ticket to vote, and that locks you in for a month for that cost, and you get a block reward. So it's half proof of work, half proof of stake sort of deal. It was invented by Charlie Lee and implemented by these guys who actually, some of them work on the Lightning Network for Bitcoin. So it's a pretty good team. And they introduced the concept of just rewarding the voters in general because they're as important. I mean, they are the controlling party. They're vesting some, become part of the system. Their incentives are aligned with the system now. It's just a lot of correct design choices, I think. Combined with DPoS, I think it's very powerful. And I hope more people maybe talk about it. Maybe there's downsides I'm not aware of, but it just seems like it's the best of both worlds. And the difference between our system and the other system, just to clarify, is those guys vote for, once the block producer gets paid, they give part of that to the voters, right? So you only vote for the active producers. In this case, in Decred in our design, the voters get reward no matter who they vote for, even if they're undecided, just by vesting coins into the system to vote. They get a reward from the block reward directly. It doesn't matter if they vote for somebody who is ranked last. It doesn't matter if they vote for themselves or a dummy or undecided choice. But because, and why it matters is because now, as soon as they vote, they're locked in. Their incentives are now aligned with the system for, like, let's say a month. I don't think we decided exactly on the timeframes yet, but a month is a typical amount of time for the market to digest the news, for example. So we want to make sure that the attackers go down with the ship, basically, and that's the difference. That we just pay for the act of voting, for participating in security, because in the end, decentralization is about control, and participating in that decentralization, as many people as possible, should be incentivized.
Out of curiosity, who pays? I mean, is it an inflationary system where it has an unlimited amount of coins and the fees are paying them, or is there going to be a fixed amount and they're paid out of a certain supply?
I don't know. Asphyxia, we haven't really talked too much about it. We wanted like a mixed system, possibly of fees and inflation, to maybe give options for both while we decide. I'm not sure. I brought up both ideas, but through having an inflation, you can get rid of fees completely. You can have better aligned incentives, and we can keep it as low as possible, just enough to pay block producers. We're not trying to make millionaires overnight from just mining a single block. We just want some kind of income to give some incentives.
So maybe you should talk about some of the problems that that BitShares has encountered over the years in regards to how their system currently functions.
Speaking of Dan Latimer.
Yeah, so there's two.
BitShares doesn't have inflation. Am I correct?
Yeah, so there's two GPOS systems I know of that do not have inflation. One is Nano, which is renamed Raiblocks, and one is BitShares. They also have other things that are, it's the earlier versions of DPoS, and actually, Nano is like a kind of partially copied DPoS. I'm not sure, but basically, I'll talk about why the BitShares, why inflation is kind of nice. So one is you can get rid of the fees completely. So the way, and it only is really possible in a DPoS system, with the right incentives still. So in BitShares, for example, you have whenever you do a transaction, you have a fee that goes into a treasury, and then the decentralized DAO since 2014 has been trying to fund developers and stuff. But the problem becomes, so if you have a fixed income and all this money is going into the treasury, so the whales realize they can just not pay anybody, and it'll get money out of the system, and it won't dilute their bags. In fact, they'll make their bags more scarce, and it'll increase the value of them relatively to the rest of the money, reduce supply and all. So they can actually, they can profit fiscally, or at least they're incentivized not to fund projects, which is actually how Dan Larimer was fired by BitShares, because they refused to fund his several projects where he wanted to add some bonds and all kinds of stuff to the BitShares network. Back then, I looked it up. The market cap for BitShares was only 8 million, which is crazy, right? We forgot those numbers. That's actually comparable to us now, right? Which is insane. And they just, at that point, even a pretty decent salary for enough developers was a lot of money for the treasury to pay. So I kind of get it, but as well, a lot of it was driven by not pay.
It was about $60,000, which in retrospect, anybody would pay for a developer now. So
Yeah, exactly. And he's like, he invented the system. He knew it really well. Is it working? Um, it was. I mean, now they're funding a lot of developers, but now their market cap is a lot more. So it's a very small percentage to pay that cost for a developer now. So they're learning from the past mistakes, but also it's kind of funny because he got fired by his own DAO because of the not aligned incentives. Basically, it's kind of sad. So in the next iteration, he decided to fund it from the inflation. I think its team it starts at like 9% and it's going to go to like 0.5% or something like that over like 10 years. I could be wrong about the numbers, but it's a ramp down over time, and it could be something like this here. I think in the US they decided to just fix it at 5% constant, and this doesn't all just go to the producers. It also goes mostly to the DAO, which distributes it based on like votes, but it also pays the producers. But in that case, since the money is going to go into the system anyway, there's no way to block it. So you can't just decide, oh, I'm not going to like dilute myself. I'll just block every funding proposal. No, it's just going to get distributed differently, but it's going to get distributed anyway. So you just might as well vote for the best project and hope that increases the value of your bag versus trying to avoid anything. And I think that was the biggest thing. And the other thing is, of course, having no fees. So normally you have a block size of like, I don't know, random megabytes or whatever, and you distribute it, you rank them by fees. So whoever pays the highest fee goes first because miners want fees. So this is called the bandwidth model, which is the free fee model. In the bandwidth model, you distribute based on the percent of vested stake that you have versus everybody else. So if you have 1% of all the coins vested that are vested right now, as in locked in, staked or whatever, for a month or whatever, because you voted or whatever, it's a lot of whatevers. You guarantee that 1% of the entire bandwidth the system is capable of. So you always have some ability to send transactions at some rate based on the percentage you have. And it's just a different way to distribute the scarce block space without going to like terabytes per millisecond range, where the whole network will break apart and form little sub networks, and it was just a huge mess. So you get those two benefits from having an inflation. And I like the idea of deflationary currency like Bitcoin as well. It's an interesting design. There's also papers talking about how dangerous it would be to have no block reward at the end as well. And why, like, for example, Monero developers decided to have a finite emission at the end, which is just set to a specific number, some low amount of XMR, but it still exists because they were worried about some cases where there is no punishment for not mining the right chain properly. It's been a while since I read that paper, but basically it talks about different attacks that are possible when everything is just a fee and no block reward. That's it for now. That's all I can think of right now.
No, awesome wisdom you dropped on us there, man, for sure. I learned a shitload about DPoS. I don't know about you guys.
I mean, have you guys defined exactly the penalties and everything to avoid people, taking bribes, or how you're going to remove them from the community, or exactly what you're doing for certain penalties?
There's certain numbers that we're interested in trying out on the testnet, and then we're going to sort of see how that works out. Because, like I mentioned before, in terms of when you design the economics incentives of a system, it can be a long time before you really see that you messed up in terms of the planning. Like, take for example what Unicron pointed out in regards to BitShares. Because of the fact that it was non-inflationary, the whales of the system are incentivized to not actually release any of the funds from the DAO. Otherwise, they're essentially diluting themselves. Whereas when you have an inflationary currency, it encourages you to, the holders of that currency, to always be spending the money and have cash flow. Otherwise, they're essentially punished for holding on to it. So this is true even in some of the bigger economies of the world, like America, for example. And for the zero fee model, it works. I think in regards to deflationary currencies like Bitcoin versus other blockchains that are permanently inflationary, I think there are different objectives trying to be solved here. So, for example, where Bitcoin tries to be a monetary unit, I can sort of understand it. But if you take, for example, the way Steam works, if Steam didn't have the zero fee model, which can only be achieved by having this constant inflation, it would fail as a system. And so, what I mean by that is, for example, if you told a user of the system that you had to go out and acquire a niche cryptocurrency to post a blog, who would want to do that? You would you would decrease adoption by a lot because the barrier to entry is very difficult at that point. Or even if you didn't need to do that, if you had to just spend money every time you were using the system for things like for posting those blog posts, you almost feel like you're punished for posting content on the system.
Almost. I
It can
definitely.
be spammy though.
So right, but the spam is prevented by the way how the bandwidth model works because it limits how much you can spam the system. So this is where I try to bait Road Crypto into talking by segueing to some stuff that's going on in the Bitcoin Cash community. So I don't know like how much you guys follow other communities, but they recently had something called memo.cash. And the best way to sum it up, like what it is it's basically Twitter on the blockchain. And it's actually really similar to something that I had in mind in terms of what can be built on Novusphere, the way it works, especially in terms of the protocol design. But it suffers from the big problem that because it's built on Bitcoin Cash, which by nature has to have a fee model, you're always going to feel like you're punished for using the system because you are losing, the monetary unit, Bitcoin Cash, every time you make a post or every time you vote for someone.
So, just out of curiosity, are you saying that this would be a good model for having, say, our own Twitter on Novusphere?
Yes. So you need a system where the users aren't paying a fee for something like that. If that's part of the reason as to why Steam users can easily adopt Steam. All you have to do is, once you sign up, you can start using the system. You don't have to buy any tokens in advance. But if you want to use memo.cash on Bitcoin Cash, then you'd have to own Bitcoin Cash in advance. And who really wants to do that? Right? You're not going to convince someone to buy Bitcoin Cash just to use, this quote-unquote decentralized Twitter. But it is good for the censorship-resistant part, yes, of course. But, Steam, of course, offers that same aspect. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. It's just the underlying blockchain is a questionable choice. The other problem that it has with being built on Bitcoin Cash is nobody's using it. And what I mean by that is, like, if there was a lot of people using it, you would see severe problems in terms of the block space and the block times. Given the block time of Bitcoin Cash is 10 minutes, and there's a limit in terms of the block space, which is to me is really if I feel almost antithetical to their project. So it seems weird to me that they plan on doing a hard fork to increase that limit to 32 megabytes. But I think given the nature of their project, it would make more sense for them to just almost get rid of it altogether. I don't think they realize it but by having a block size limit, they almost are indirectly admitting to the fact that there's a reason for one.
Like, people will go within that niche, and if something like that is bottlenecked, they will find other sources.
So there's some things from this that we can actually gain though, because so this goes back to what I mentioned before, which is I think as a project, Bitcoin Cash is an interesting project, but they do have a lot of bad actors in their community. But the point is that since they are doing research in the direction of bigger blocks, which not a lot of other people are doing. If they do find and somehow implement stuff that's useful, other projects, i.e. Bitcoin, can use that information. And if they don't find anything, then at the end of the day, they're just another altcoin, spin-off, no matter how they decide to market it. And one of the nice things about how Memo.cash is currently set up is a lot of it is open source and free to use. So later down the road, we can take something very similar and implement it on top of Novusphere, and it really fixes the big underlying problem of that entire project, which is the fact that you are paying fees for every action that you do on the blockchain.
So
Memo. Can we get like .novusphere registered with the ICANN so we can start making .novusphere domains?
Maybe shorter.
Yeah.
.atmos, how about that?
Affix.
There you go. I'm liking this. So, okay, I'm curious though, in regards to this. Let's see, Unicorn or Unicron. I'm sorry,
of these questions answered.
said something along the lines of, it wouldn't really be a Twitter. It would be more like a decentralized communication on chain. I just have a question about this in general. So I guess the reason why Twitter is so prolific and so powerful is because of the way that information spreads through it. What's the difference between putting something like this on the blockchain and just using standard encryption for chat, like WhatsApp or whatever, Signal?
Well, the main difference would be the censorship-resistant factor of how that information is stored and constantly relayed to people, right? So when you send something on WhatsApp, I'm gonna go on the limb and say because it's end-to-end encrypted, the servers don't need to store any of that data. Now maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know how restoring a chat session works on WhatsApp, but in this case here, that information is preserved on the blockchain. But I think what Unicron is getting at here is you kind of need a hybrid solution for Twitter, because just having the blockchain alone doesn't give you all the use cases of Twitter. So what I mean by that is, like, when you follow someone, it's not like the blockchain's gonna send you a notification to say, hey, this person put out a tweet. So you need sort of a centralized server that's also running and monitoring the blockchain. Now I don't know if that's actually open source code for Memo.cash, if anyone can self-host it. But as you guys already know, self-hosting is a really big aspect of the project that I'm always trying to push, which is I feel like the user should always be able to fully self-host everything, so long as they have the hardware to do so. But if they don't, then that's a big problem, because even though that information is there on the blockchain, if you're forced to use the Memo.cash website, and nobody's actually really using the blockchain as a means of double checking that information, it is possible for censorship to occur, because Memo.cash as a centralized gateway could censor a user and prevent their let's call it tweets from showing up. But even though those tweets are in the blockchain, right, nobody's going to really know about it because everyone is using the Memo.cash website, and they have no way of self-hosting.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. So I think there's a few chat questions here. I'm not sure how many are actually answered by Unicorn and how many need to be answered still.
We could still read
Okay.
some out here.
Okay, do you want to read them out, and then I can try to answer them?
Yes, so I'll start with Fixed. Fixed is there any disadvantages to having more block producers selected at random from the top 100? So 21 total with the top 20, plus a random from the next 80. Is having more randomly selected an issue?
So you're saying that you have the top 20 plus like a random person out of the top 80? Or sorry, the next top 80? Is that correct, Fixed?
Yeah, it's a standard design for like Steam.
Yeah, so I don't really see a problem with it because you do want standby witnesses or standby delegates, and the big reason for that is, so let's compare mining pools and DPoS here, which is if you can successfully attack a mining pool, which is at the end of the day a singular network, and that mining pool goes offline, then that blockchain loses all the hash power that mining pool has. I don't think most miners are configured in such a way where if they lose connection to a certain mining pool, they fall back onto another mining pool.
Most are not. Most are not.
So it will take time for the network to adjust for something like that. So that's a potential, big cut down in time of how fast blocks are being produced, because the difficulty won't be adjusted fast enough. But
Yes.
if in the case of DPoS, if someone is kicked offline, like let's say the top 5 producers are kicked offline, the top 5 witnesses or delegates, then their spot can easily be filled by the runners up. So the system easily and very quickly adjusts itself if it's under attack.
Okay, so we have a question from Road Crypto. He was asking, so are fees actually necessary then if we do a crypto Twitter for communication on chain? Server owners can't censor you out.
It's actually the opposite, which is I was saying the big problem Memo.cash has is the fact that it has fees, because you're essentially punished when you make a tweet or when you like a tweet, because everything you do is a transaction which involves paying a fee to the blockchain, and blockchains based on Bitcoin require a fee. So we don't need a fee, because in the bandwidth model you can push these state updates. So a state update can be this user liked something, or this user just put out a new tweet, and that will cost the user zero in terms of what they pay to do so. So as long as they're not spamming the blockchain. Right, because the way the bandwidth model works is users have a limited amount of space in the block designated based on the amount that they have. And if a user doesn't have any coins at all, there is a space in the block that's allocated towards free users, essentially. So people who don't have any coins.
Okay, so an exchange went on in the chat real quick while you were answering that for Road Crypto, which seems to have understood. I'd actually, if you don't mind, Fixed, would you mind clarifying and repeating your question on air? If not, I can quote it for you. And Unicorn seems to understand it, so maybe he can tackle the question.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if we had, extra block producers who would be randomly selected, it might encourage a more quality set of the top 100 block producers. So we'd have, more than just say the first 20 being really high quality. We might actually see, the next, say, 50 being people who are wanting to try to get in the top 20, but they're still being rewarded by more than just one block reward every random amount. Because there'd maybe be 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever it is. So just wondering if that's been thought about or played around with.
Unicorn?
Well, basically, you have two extremes, right? If everybody's random, you get Lisk, right? So all top 100 will get paid equally almost. And then you have to vote out everybody out of top 100 completely to punish them. Versus having top 20, which is much easier to vote out and still have a lot of delegates and be able to keep track of their behavior, all on the same page in one view. What's their latency, how many missed blocks they missed. It's all instantly available. And if you're, if you're number 1 or number 2 and you misbehave, it's not as hard to get you out completely to where you almost don't matter, with 1 block per 21 or whatever. Versus for somebody, 1 vote per 21 votes, versus versus voting somebody who's number 1 up to 102nd spot. He has to get rid of a lot of votes to actually kick them out completely to where they're not affecting consensus.
I think it makes a lot of sense to me. Let me just clarify for my own edification here. So basically, you're saying that having a smaller pool of delegates is overall safer for the network, because if there's a large pool of delegates, not only can humans have a harder time tracking what the delegates are up to, but also the overall network is harder to manipulate.
Yes, I think so. Like, imagine there's an attacker, right? And you want him to lose influence as fast as possible. Instead of having to vote them 100 spaces down, you vote them 5, 10, 15, and then they lose most of the influence. But meanwhile, that one block reward every round or whatever, it's giving incentive it gives two main things, which is all the standby block producers in the top 80, they have to keep their nodes good. They have to be online. They have to get the block reward. So they get some payment out of it. And the second is, and if they ever want to be like a final block producer, their stats for that one rare block that just randomly happens sometimes, it has to be good. They can't just miss all their blocks when they're a standby producer and expect to get into top 20.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. That's a pretty fair system. I'm glad that you've put a lot of thought into that.
Oh, this is Dan Larimer. But
fair enough.
This is many people talking, and he's one of the engineers, but he put a lot of, he's been working on this in active environment with money in it since 2014, and seen a lot of iterations and a lot of discussions, not just him, but a lot of people. Just one more thing. A lot of people think it's just like top 100 or something. It's actually, there's an unlimited number of block producers. Anybody can become a standby block producer, but you have to limit it somewhat to like top 100, let's say. Or you actually don't. It's just it's based on how many coins you have after top 20. So so you might not get paid very much if you're very low in the rank because you don't have as many people voting for you. But there's an unlimited number of people. So even if everybody's attacked, there's always somebody who has the next highest ranking, if you know what I mean. So there's not like only 20 nodes globally or 100 nodes globally that can possibly support the network. It could be as many as you want. You could start new nodes while yours is down and join in and ask people to vote for you. It's not just 100 nodes. I think we were talking about DDoS attacks before, and that's kind of something we discussed. It's like if you're missing blocks, you're going to get temporarily removed, and somebody else is going to take your spot, the next highest person, until you come back up and you make a signal. And
okay, I'm glad that you opened the subject of DDoS attacks. I'm actually the one who addressed this with Asphyxia. I have a decent amount of experience in this field, running servers and being a server operator. DDoS attacks are something I'm no guest to. So basically it's like this. The first attack vector when Asphyxia was designing his protocol that I pointed out was that he was running a peer discovery protocol. I think it was Signal R. I was able to discover peers running on this network by simply typing in a JavaScript command into my console. That being said, he's a sense addressed the concept of peer discovery and creating hardened nodes, but I'm just actually curious overall as to what you think the economic impact would be of an actual DDoS attack on, say, I mean, you're saying there's only 20. Did he just drop out? Oh, no, he's back anyway. You're saying there's only going to only be 20 block producers or 20 delegates at any one time. I mean, what do you think the financial impact would be if they were to get discovered and attacked?
Well, then the next 20 would take over, right? And one is random, so you'd have to get rid of all like 100 block producers basically for the attack to be severe enough, and then you still have standby producers below that vote limit. So however many approval votes the 100th person has, 101st will have a little less, but he'll become the highest ranked active node at that point.
Generally speaking, you can knock nodes out via an attack, but unless you're attacking every node on the network simultaneously, somebody's always going to take the node's place and continue the block producing on the network.
That's the goal, but also there's also the concept of how much proof of work is behind the security, right? If you have less proof of work, the network is less secure in general as a concept, right? So let's say a mining pool is attacked and the hash rate drops dramatically. Technically, you can say there's less security now. So in a vested stake, it's how much stake is behind the production, right? The voters the voters assigned to somebody is what controls it. So at some point, if you have too little stake protecting the network because all the higher stakes were voted out, maybe you wait for more confirmations. Then you know what I mean. Like you make sure the network comes back up to where it reaches somewhat more of a consensus and recovers. So there's times when there's more uncertainty than other times. That's what I'm trying to say. Same as if the hash power of Bitcoin drops to like 0.01% right now, we'll probably wait for more confirmations, right? Same as if 90% of the stake suddenly disappears and 1% of total, supply is enough to swing the block production. That's not good, and we should not consider that finite. Or
Well, let's quantify this factor as uncertainty. Is this uncertainty going to be output by the network, or is it up to the third parties utilizing the network to figure out how uncertain the network is?
I think it's always third parties.
Gotcha.
It's always up to the third party to decide, because even if you look at, let's say, an exchange, the exchange is the person who decides what's the acceptable number of confirmations that I want from the network before I decide that this is good enough for me.
That does make a lot of sense. Excellent. All right. Well, that definitely clarifies my question. I'm just curious, does anybody else have general questions that they want to throw at the team here? I mean, this is an optimal opportunity to have anything you want answered by these guys.
Asphyxia, you should talk about your sort of invention of temporary punishments. I liked it a lot. Where you, instead of having, I think, what was Vitalik's calling slashing conditions, where you permanently lose money, we're doing more of a temporary punishment for the network to keep working, but the money isn't lost permanently. You just can't earn more money because you're out of the game for a little bit.
I feel like you guys are talking about some like way complex blockchain stuff, so maybe roll it back a notch and explain.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay, well, this is a good segue for me to mention like two things before I go into that, which is there will be an update to the code later this week to add some interconnectivity of the network. So I'll post an update once that's ready, and then there will be more stuff for people to start help testing. And I will tomorrow actually be starting a review of the white paper with Unicron. And so once we're done workshopping that a little bit, we're going to look to share that with the community and get some feedback on it before we're ready to release it publicly. And to give you an idea ahead of time what the white paper is going to be like, it's going to be fairly as brief and concise as possible. So fairly similar to how the Bitcoin white paper is structured. So what I mean by that is the Bitcoin white paper isn't very, very technical. You don't need a very big technical background to understand what Satoshi's talking about. He actually leaves out a lot of minor details in terms of Bitcoin. So what I mean by that is Bitcoin has the Bitcoin script language, for example. That's not mentioned anywhere in the white paper.
If you don't mind me interrupting for a second, I'd like to point out from a business standpoint, a white paper should always be abstract enough for a non-technical person to be able to read it and understand it.
Right, and so our objective here is to put this out initially so that it gives people a better understanding of the project and adds more legitimate value for outsiders to read and understand all the information is finally in one place. And the other thing that we'll put out in the future is a more technical paper, so that would be more similar to the Lightning white paper, which is very long and very technical, or for example the Simplicity paper that was put out not too long ago by Blockstream, which again is very long and very technical. So unless you have a heavy background in math and computer science, you're going to struggle with those papers.
Yeah, if I might make a suggestion from the business end of things, definitely release the second one as more of a specification document at a later time to gear.
Right, it's not as high of a priority to us at this point in time than the higher level one is. So, what was the initial question that I diverged from?
Oh, actually, you have a unique punishment system. That's
right. Okay, yeah, so what the idea is that if a user misses, let's say, a block, or so this would be in the case of block production if a user acts out against the system. So this might not be malicious. This could just be the user was offline and they missed their turn, or maybe a user was being attacked, right? Maybe they were suffering from a DDoS attack. The user isn't losing their stake permanently. It's more so that the system will cast a negative approval vote against that user. So what I mean by that is, so typically the way the system is ranked is based on the approval voting of the users of the system. But if you're missing your turn, then the system itself will cast negative approval votes towards you, and we're thinking that will likely be a percentage. So every time, let's say you miss your turn, you will lose some of your approval voting. So even let's say you're number one on the block producer list and you miss your turn, if you get lowered temporarily 10%, that might be enough to, let's say, knock you down to 7th place. And you miss your turn again. Okay, now you're down to maybe, 18th place. And then eventually you get kicked off the entire list, after you've been punished several times. But this is a decaying factor. So after, let's say, maybe you missed your turn once, but then everything is fine after that. The effects of the punishment decay over time. So the system goes back to normal for you. So it's not like you're permanently punished for, acting out against it, because it's not always your fault. And so this same concept can be also applied to handling arbiters in terms of the content system. So, for example, the way, if there's a case that needs to be solved between a person who submits content and a person a bounty hunter, and an arbiter has to make a decision, it's a blind voting process. So one of the ways an arbiter could act out against the system is to have to commit to a blind vote, and then never reveal who that blind vote is. So the incentive they would have to do that is because if they know that they're a minority voter, they know that they're going to be punished. So they would be like, okay, I can be smart about this and not actually tell anyone who I voted for. So we need to have something in place so that if the person committed to voting, but they never actually showed us who their real person they voted for is, they are punished in some way. And so then that arbiter can get kicked off the list of people who are handling cases where there are disputes between bounty hunters and people issuing bounties.
I just have to draw a parallel here. The system sounds very, very, very similar to how video games deploy an ELO system. Just have to say, there's a similarity I noticed.
In what way?
I'm sorry, what?
In what way?
Oh, simply.
Can you explain those systems?
Crypto asks, what's ELO?
Oh yeah. Sorry. So basically, in video games, ELO has become a very standardized weighting system for how people are ranked in competitive matchmaking, and the formula is different for every game, but more or less, it's accepted that matchmaking is dependent on your skill level, but skill level can only be determined by a ratio of 1 to loss games. This same sort of system can be applied here by saying that a node gets value based on how much time it's spent on the network and how little time it's been off the network. So you could say that it gets an ELO rating depending on how many blocks it's won and how many blocks it's lost. And it just sounds extremely similar. Like there's a close parallel in terms of how a matchmaking system might rank a person for losing a large amount of blocks, even though it's not their fault for losing those blocks and being stuck in a certain area without having the chance to succeed. This use case, I might say, would be in the case of a network-wide attack, where certain nodes who are otherwise large-scale producers might be getting tagged, and without their own volition, they might produce a large amount of bad blocks, giving them a lower ranking in the system overall that they don't deserve. Thoughts on this subject?
Some with the technology that don't have the technology. They're very dependent on that blockchain.
Actually, that raises a point, Mr. Wicks. The same could be said for block producers in third world countries who have non-continuous internet connections. What if they start getting this bad, for the sake of my analogy, ELO rating, just because they don't have a steady internet connection?
So because of the way DPoS networks typically work, the incentives are slightly aligned a little differently, where you don't actually want to design the network in such a way where everyone needs to go out of their way to implement things so that people in, let's say, third world countries that have very bad internet connections are running or are being block producers in this case. They can validate the network. So what I mean by that is, if you want to fully validate all your transactions, there's no problem in doing that. You can run the software on your computer. You'll be obviously behind people because of your slower internet connection, but you are verifying instead of trusting. But because you have the slower internet connection, you are not actually able to participate in the network to as great of an extent that people with the better internet connections are able to. So this has to do also with the fact that if you think about it, if you are using a very poor internet connection and you are attacked, you're very likely to go offline, which means you will temporarily lose your spot as a block producer until you can somehow mitigate that attack or get around it. Whereas if you have the proper infrastructure, you'll be able to sustain through that attack. So if you think about it, I'm sure a lot of mining pools have in place vectors so that if they are attacked, they don't go offline.
Yeah, so they would have to cut off all communications in that sense.
Well, it depends how they're connected to the network. So we raised the point before that we might look into the idea of, having a hardened node system where, certain people can advertise, connect directly to my node, and I'll relay, your blocks for you, and you can just pay me, a small fee under the table or something like that for this service, and that way you're not exposed to the rest of the network. And if you look at Bitcoin, this is done through fiber, except fiber is provided for free by NAT, and miners can connect to fiber and have their blocks relate to other mining pools. And so it speeds up block propagation a lot, because instead of blocks having to propagate throughout the network, they can actually go from one miner to the fiber network directly to another miner. So very quickly.
Okay.
So if you have a poor internet connection or you're at risk of being attacked, you may wish to consider using a service that can help you mitigate those attacks.
Right. So in the case of like a mining pool, most mining pools use stratum-based reverse proxies to forward their TCP connections. You're saying that a hardened node would act sort of like a stratum TCP proxy for the node users with bad connections.
No, that's not correct. What I mean is, so yes, that is one way that miners protect themselves, but the added layer that sort of speeds up block propagation is the fact that it passes through fiber. So a miner can actually avoid connecting to the rest of the network, and they can just only be connected to fiber if they want. They don't have to let anyone else discover them.
Real quick, I just wanted to interrupt you and say thanks, Unicron, for attending, man. Your insight was beautiful.
Yes. Thank you so much.
All right, sorry to interrupt you. Please continue, Asphyxia.
Yeah, take care, Unicron. So assuming the miners in this case, they trust the fiber network, they don't need to connect to anyone, because they can just only connect to fiber, and fiber will tell them, here's a new block, and, they can tell fiber, okay, I just created a new block. And that sort of puts them in a bubble away from the rest of the network.
So it's like off-chain mining, sort of. They're technically mining on their own chain until fiber resyncs.
Sure, there's a trust aspect here that's involved, right? Which is the fact that fiber isn't compromised, or fiber isn't, selling their data or something along those lines. Fiber's not willing to, let's say, turn over their IP addresses to, let's say, a government, identity, or a potential attacker who's willing to bribe fiber into giving that information. So, you have two options, which is you either, again, in this example here, you either trust fiber and you use the service, or you employ your own security mechanisms to ensure that you stay online, even if you're attacked.
Okay, so this goes towards hardened nodes. You can either opt into the network centralized hardened nodes, or you can harden your own node. That's what you said.
Exactly.
Okay, I got you. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, I was actually curious myself. I don't know if you've actually said it or not, but I'm generally wondering when you're planning on releasing the network code so I can break your blockchain.
Oh, I mentioned that earlier. I said there's gonna be an update later this week where I'm going to be adding
I'm
some of
gonna
the.
press you for something a little more firm than later this week. Anything? Any juicy details?
Algorithms.
Well, it'll be later this weekend. I mean, it'll be the first of several, updates that are going to be. I'm aiming for, something along the lines of weekly updates.
I
So
swear
that
this guy dodges deadlines like a ninja dodges kunai, bro. I swear to God.
as soon as it's ready, it's ready. So.
All right, that's cool.
Any more web client
Well, the
updates?
problem with
Oh.
the problem with giving hard deadlines is if let's say it's not ready by that deadline, it creates bad expectations. You know,
Yeah, I agree with that.
it's sort of very similar to how, let's say, if you tell everyone you're going to do weekly blog updates, and there isn't always new weekly information to add. Like, let's say you've been working on the same thing for 2 weeks. There isn't really a lot to say in that blog update, and it feels kind of bad to just post a blog update that has nothing in it.
Yeah, fair enough. I hear you there. I want to piggyback on Mr. Wix's question though. He was asking if there's any updates on the front end of stuff.
Yeah, so actually, I wasn't going to mention this because I had forgot, but it's a good thing you mentioned it. We have been working on the video interface, and fortunately, as I mentioned before, um, one could argue that there's some third-party development going on with other things like memo.cache, because stuff like that can be borrowed to be implemented since it's open source and free license. So once the testnet is further along, the first thing that we'll see done in terms of the web interface is integration, so that you can use the testnet from the web interface, and then after that you'll see the video interface merged into that, and then again we'll have community review to see what's a priority in terms of the interface development. Because once the underlying system is done, it becomes a matter of what does the community feel is the most interesting to build on top of the infrastructure.
Yeah, they're all gonna save videos. Let's just be real.
I get that, but what I mean by that is, what's important to build? What does the community value? Is it movies, or sharing, content? Is it, a decentralized Twitter? Is it a decentralized Reddit? And where those, how the community feels about that will really govern what we decide is a priority in terms of development.
All right. Any chance of that vote being done on the blockchain?
Yeah, of course.
Cool. Awesome. Sounds cool. All right. So I know you like dodging deadlines like a ninja. So I'm gonna say instead of a firm deadline, do you think I'll be able to watch a video on this thing in, say, the month of June? Sooner?
Video on. Oh, you mean like a video on the
Yeah,
blockchain?
on the
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think that might be a reasonable timeline at this
You're
point in
thinking
time.
about June-ish.
Yeah, possibly around that time. I'll ask me about this question, as time progresses, and I'll be able to give more of a concrete answer as we go forward.
All right.
It's kind of the best analogy I can give here is this is a funny analogy that you might respect, which is one day some guy who's doing TA might be very uh, bearish about the network, and he might say, bearish about the price, and he might say, the price is going into the trash can, and the next day his opinion might change, completely. So you can't just hold me to it if I say it's going to be out in June, because it might be sooner than that, depending on how things go, or it might take a little longer.
Here's to you, buddy. And
So keep asking.
For sure, absolutely. I live for the Kumo twist, my friend. Okay, well that's cool. Is there any other community questions or anybody else have anything to ask him?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. People put pins in things. Where's Monopoly when you
There's
need
a
him?
pin.
All right. Well, if nobody has anything else to add, I'll ask Asphyxia. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add, buddy?
I think we've covered some of the main topics, which was Unicron got to say his piece sort of on DPoS history and sort of the economics of the system, and it kind of gave you guys an idea of the back and forth conversations that me and Unicron have been having in regards to designing the incentives of the system. Of course, you'll get to read more about that once the white paper is actually out. And
Yeah,
it kind of gives you guys an idea of what's currently going on behind the scenes, because I know things have been a little quiet for a while now. So,
all right, again, I know you hate ETAs, but thoughts on the white paper? Like, when's that going to be seen?
Well, once I'm not exactly sure how fast he's going to be able to review it, because I don't know how long.
Wait, so you're saying it's already written? It's just in review?
Right, I'm done writing the my part of it, so right now I just want him to read it over, give me his input on it, edit it, and then once that's done, we're gonna give it to the community so they can, pick it apart, and maybe there's things that they feel are best or good to add. Because like I mentioned, we're obviously not describing the full aspect of the system. So for example, in Bitcoin, the 21 million limit's not mentioned anywhere in the white paper. So there are certain things that we avoid mentioning because we're just trying to give.
You need to read the Bitcoin white paper, dude. Jeez.
We're just giving a high level overview of how the system works so people understand that. But if there are things that we left out or that people feel we should put in there, then we encourage all feedback and we'll take that into consideration when we publish the final draft.
Awesome, man. Well, I think we should probably wrap things up here. I just wanted to say thanks again to Unicron Primus. Insightful as always. I'm sure he'll listen to this again. Asphyxia, man, always a pleasure to hear from you, dude. And just a shout out to my man Fix, to my man Mr. Wicks. Thank you both for actually using your voices and attending. Let's get some more people talking in the next one, huh?
For sure.
That'd be really cool.
Y'all continue giving updates about Bitcoin Cash until Road Crypto says something.
Awesome.
Also, we're gonna have we're streaming right now, so we're gonna have a little replay on YouTube and also SoundCloud recording.
Oh, awesome! So you're gonna have that up tonight?
Yep.
Yeah, please send that over to Crypto Mom once you have it ready, and she can share that with the rest of the community.
All right,
Okay.
cool.
Sounds good.
All right, guys, thanks for your time, and catch you on the flip side.
Bye.